My name is Maria Gutierrez. When I moved to the United States, I was 40 years old, with little more than the clothes on my back, a couple $100s in my pocket, and a deep-seated belief that if I worked hard enough, anything could be mine. I didn't come here for fame or fortune. I came for the promise of something better, something I could call my own. I arrived from Mexico in the dead of winter. The cold hit me harder than I'd imagined, but I barely noticed it. I was too consumed by the noise of my own thoughts, the hum of the airplane still echoing in my ears, and the overwhelming feeling that the world I knew was behind me. The one thing I did know was that I had to make it work, for me, for my future. It was early in the morning when I first saw the Lawrence family home. The house seemed impossibly large, standing tall at the edge of an affluent neighborhood. There were manicured lawns stretching endlessly on both sides, tall, stately trees lining the front, and a perfect little garden tucked near the stone path leading to the front door. It was everything I had imagined life would be when I was younger, elegant, pristine, and untouched by the worries of the world, the kind of house that belonged in a magazine, not in someone's daily life, the kind of place I would never have dared to dream of owning, but I would spend more time there than I could ever have imagined. I was hired by the Lawrence family to clean their home, and to be honest, I had no expectations beyond that. My role was simple, housekeeper, a position many immigrants like me took without question. I didn't know much about the family at first, just that they were rich, they lived in a big house, and they needed someone to keep it tidy. I came from a small, humble town, so the fact that I had a job in a house like this felt like a small victory. The family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence and their two children, Laura, who was in her teens, and Daniel, just a few years younger. They were polite, always greeting me in the morning with a quick, "Hello, Maria," and a brief nod before hurrying off to their respective routines. The children were well-mannered, though they didn't speak to me much. It was clear from the start that I was an outsider in their world, a necessary part of their household that they barely saw. Mrs. Lawrence would occasionally call me Maria, honey, but only when no one else was around. It was always a little too sweet, too rehearsed, like she was performing kindness for a role rather than offering it from the heart. Still, I was grateful. I needed this job. And so, I did my work in silence, getting up early every day to clean, dust, and prepare the house. I ironed their shirts, cleaned their bathrooms, vacuumed their pristine carpets, and took out the trash. I folded laundry while they ate breakfast in the dining room, a room where I was never invited to sit, and where my presence was barely acknowledged beyond a passing glance. I listened to their conversations as I worked, trivial things mostly. Mrs. Lawrence's complaints about the latest designer trends, Mr. Lawrence discussing his job, their children's school activities. I was there, but I was never really part of the scene. Over time, I learned things, small things, details about the family that they thought no one noticed. How Mr. Lawrence's temper flared when things didn't go his way. How Mrs. Lawrence would drink wine in the afternoons to pass the time. And how their children grew more distant as they aged. They were polite, yes, but there was an invisible line that separated us, a line that had nothing to do with words, but everything to do with class, wealth, and privilege. I was their servant, and they were my employers. Nothing more. I was careful, observant. I learned when to stay out of their way, when to speak, and when to keep quiet. There were the occasional moments when I was included in conversations, but they were fleeting, always polite and surface level. I never once felt that I belonged. Their world, their lives, they were out of my reach, but I was too proud to admit how much that stung. There were moments of tenderness too, though rare. Sometimes, after a long day of cleaning, Mrs. Lawrence would come into the kitchen and offer me a cup of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she poured it from the fancy silver pot. Her voice would soften, and she'd ask, "How are you, Maria? How's everything?" But that was always followed by a hurried look, a glance at the clock, and a quick, "Well, I have to get going now. Take care." That was it. I was never invited into their lives, not truly. I spent 22 years like this, living in the background, keeping the house running while they went about their perfect lives. I had no idea how the world saw me, whether I was invisible or just another cog in their carefully orchestrated machine. But as the years went on, something changed inside me. Something began to shift. A quiet understanding that I had given so much, yet received so little in return. I was getting older, yes, but I wasn't invisible. I was smart, I was observant, and I knew how to play the game. I would never be one of them, but I had the power to change the rules. It started with a simple, overheard conversation, something that, at the time, I thought meant nothing, something that, in hindsight, would change everything. It was a Tuesday, just like any other. I had arrived early, as I always did, to begin my day of cleaning the Lawrence family's sprawling home. Mrs. Lawrence had already left for her usual spa appointment, and Mr. Lawrence was out on some business trip, leaving just me and the house to ourselves. I knew their schedules well by now, and I could count on the fact that I would have several hours of solitude to get everything done. But that day was different. The house was still and quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I was in the laundry room, folding clothes, when I heard voices approaching from the hallway, faint but unmistakable. It was Mrs. Lawrence and her daughter, Laura. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but their conversation was loud enough for me to catch every word. "I think it's time we let Maria go," Mrs. Lawrence said, her voice low but sharp, as if she was sharing a secret. "She's getting older, and it's getting expensive. I'm sure she could retire by now, don't you think?" Laura's voice followed, dismissive and indifferent. "Yeah, she's been here forever. Maybe she'll finally get the hint. She's probably too tired to work anymore." I froze, the laundry basket in my hands, forgotten. The words hit me harder than I expected. I had always known that I was considered replaceable, that I was merely an employee to them, but hearing it out loud from the very people I had served for over 2 decades made something inside me snap. "She's good at cleaning, I'll give her that," Mrs. Lawrence continued, "but she's not part of the family. She never will be. It's just not worth keeping her around anymore." I felt my chest tighten, my breath growing shallow. The silence that followed was suffocating, and for the first time in all these years, I realized the depth of my insignificance in their lives. I wasn't just invisible, I was disposable. I had worked for the Lawrence family for 22 years. I had been there for birthdays, anniversaries, family dinners, and holiday gatherings. I had packed their bags for trips, cleaned their children's rooms as they grew, and even nursed Mrs. Lawrence when she had her knee surgery. I had given them the best of me, my time, my energy, and this is how they saw me? A liability, a problem to be solved when it became too much to maintain. I didn't know what to do in that moment. I didn't know whether to confront them or leave quietly. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let this go. That night, as I lay in bed in the small apartment I rented nearby, I couldn't stop thinking about their words. The thought of them replacing me, of someone else coming into this house, this home that I had been a part of for more than 2 decades, filled me with a rage I had never felt before. But it wasn't just anger, it was humiliation, a bitter reminder of how little I meant in the grand scheme of things. I wasn't even worthy of their respect. I was just a maid, a tool that had outlived its usefulness. But there was something else, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. It was a flicker of defiance, a recognition that I had given enough of myself to them. It was time for a change. I stayed awake for hours that night, the soft sounds of the city outside my window offering little comfort. I thought about what I could do, how I could regain control of my life. My savings, while modest, had grown over the years. I had been careful with my money, putting aside a little bit each paycheck. But more than that, I had an advantage. I had been observant. I had learned how things worked in their world, their financial struggles, their hidden debts, the cracks in the perfect facade they so carefully maintained. I knew their house was mortgaged on a substantial loan. The Lawrence family's wealth wasn't as solid as it appeared. I had overheard them talking about the pressures of keeping up with their lifestyle, the stress of living in such a large home with constant upkeep, and the mounting debts that had been slowly suffocating them. It was a chance, a glimmer of an opportunity that had been staring me in the face for years. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I made an appointment with a real estate agent. The thought was absurd at first. Who was I, a 63-year-old immigrant housekeeper, to think I could ever own a house like this? But I had a feeling, a deep conviction that I wasn't powerless. I had worked for those people for so long. I had watched, listened, and observed. I knew more than they realized, and I had a plan. The real estate agent confirmed my suspicion. The Lawrence house had been put up as collateral for a large loan, and they hadn't made any payments in nearly a year. The bank had begun foreclosure proceedings, but the Lawrence family had no idea how close they were to losing everything. The house, with its gleaming windows and manicured gardens, was no longer truly theirs. The bank was the real owner. The agent didn't know who I was buying for, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that the house was mine for the taking. I took a second loan against my modest savings and used every penny I had. My distant relatives, people who had always believed in me, helped me get across the final hurdle. It was risky, it was bold, but it felt like the only way to truly take control of my own life, to claim what had always been just out of reach. And then it happened. I won. The house, the one that had been a symbol of their wealth and power, was now mine, all mine. It felt like a dream at first. When I stood in front of the house the next morning, clutching the envelope with the final documents, I could hardly believe it. I was holding the keys to the Lawrence family's home, keys to the place I had cleaned, observed, and cared for so many years. But this wasn't just about owning a house. It was about reclaiming what I had given away for so long: my time, my energy, my life. It was about taking control of something that had always been beyond my reach. I could almost taste the satisfaction as I turned the keys in my hand. Before I let myself get too lost in the excitement of this unexpected victory, I spent the next few days making sure everything was set in motion. I was meticulous. I had to be. This wasn't just about money. This was about power. I wasn't going to let anyone ruin what I had built. I kept the details of the sale a secret. No one knew, not even the Lawrence family. Over the years, I had come to understand the dynamics of their lives, not just through what I overheard, but through the things they didn't say. I knew their financial struggles, their desperation masked by outward appearances. I saw the cracks in their perfect facade, the way they tried so hard to keep up with the Joneses. But beneath the surface, I understood that their life was built on borrowed time and borrowed money. I had been working in their home long enough to notice the small details: how they acted around money, how they worried about bills, how often they were late on payments despite their apparent wealth. The house, the grand centerpiece of their lives, was mortgaged to the hilt. Mrs. Lawrence had once confided in me about their financial troubles one rainy afternoon when she assumed I was too busy to listen. It was one of those rare moments when she dropped the pretense and let her guard down. "We've got to keep this place looking perfect, Maria," she had said, her voice tight with worry. "The mortgage is more than we can handle, and if we fall behind, well, I don't even want to think about it." I had nodded quietly, pretending to be absorbed in my work, but that conversation stuck with me. I kept track of everything. Over the next few months, I watched them more closely than ever before, noting every financial decision they made, every time they complained about the costs of maintaining their lifestyle. The cracks were widening, and I was there, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I learned about the foreclosure. The bank had finally put the house up for auction after the Lawrence family had failed to make payments for nearly a year. I watched as the facade of their perfect lives began to crumble. They hadn't even realized how far they were in debt or how close they were to losing it all. Their arrogance, their belief that they could always pay their way out of problems, had led them to this moment of vulnerability. They thought they were invincible, that the world would continue to bend to their will. But I had been watching, taking notes, and building my own strategy. I wasn't just a housekeeper, I was an observer, a strategist. I could see things others missed: small movements, subtle details, the patterns of their lives. I was always in the background, but I was always there. So, when the opportunity came to buy their house, I didn't hesitate. I used my savings, took out a second loan, and with the help of some distant relatives, I placed a bid on the house. It was risky, but it was my only chance to take control of something that had always belonged to someone else. I didn't tell anyone about my plans. I didn't want them to know. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me scramble for approval. This was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone stand in my way. The day I won the bid felt surreal. I walked out of the bank with the official paperwork in my hands, the knowledge that I now owned the Lawrence family's home sinking in slowly. It was mine, all of it. The grand staircase, the marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the garden. It was all mine, but I couldn't just let it end there. I had to be careful. I had to wait for the right moment. I knew they were on the brink of finding out, and I wanted to savor it. The timing had to be perfect. For days, I kept a careful eye on their comings and goings, waiting for the right moment to spring my surprise. I wanted to see their faces when they realized what had happened, when they understood that their perfect world had been shattered by the one person they never thought would have the power to do it: me. The bank had already called them, of course, but they thought it was a mistake. They couldn't believe it. They were convinced there had been some kind of error, but the documents spoke for themselves. Their home was no longer theirs. It was mine, and now it was time to take possession. I didn't waste time. I made sure everything was in place, and then, one afternoon, I stood outside the house, holding the new keys in my hand. I had always been a silent observer, but now I was the one in control. The phone call came on a Friday afternoon. I had been expecting it, but even then, when I heard the familiar, robotic voice of the bank representative, it still felt surreal. "Hello, Mrs. Lawrence," the voice began. "This is Bank of National Trust. We're calling to inform you that your property, located at 467 Crestwood Avenue, is no longer under your ownership. The house has been sold to a new owner. Please refer to the attached documents for further details." I could almost hear Mrs. Lawrence's gasp, the disbelief in her voice. She called immediately. I listened in as her frantic, disoriented tone filled the house, traveling through the corridors of what had once been her home. "Excuse me, this can't be right," she said. "We've never missed a payment. There's some mistake. You have to check again." Her voice wavered. For the first time in years, I heard her sound weak, vulnerable, something I hadn't imagined was possible. I stood outside the front door, hidden behind a tall bush that lined the edge of the garden, my hands shaking ever so slightly with anticipation. It was happening. They were finally going to realize it. The people who had looked down on me dismissed me as nothing more than a tool. Now they were going to see that I had control over something they had always taken for granted. The door slammed open, and I saw her first. Mrs. Lawrence, looking flustered and pale, standing in the doorway, clutching her phone tightly. Behind her was Mr. Lawrence, his face twisted with confusion and anger as he paced back and forth. He didn't understand what was happening. He probably thought this was a scam. "I told you this is all a mistake," Mrs. Lawrence shouted to her husband, her voice trembling. "I need you to fix this, Robert. Call someone. Get this straightened out." I took a step forward, just enough for them to catch a glimpse of me standing there, outside the gates. I didn't announce myself. I simply let them see the keys in my hands. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Mrs. Lawrence's eyes widened, and she stepped forward, as if trying to process what she was seeing. The reality was starting to sink in, but she was in denial. She refused to believe what was happening. "What is this?" she finally asked, her voice weak. "What are you doing here?" I stood still, taking in the scene before me. For years, I had cleaned this house, making sure everything was pristine. I had folded their clothes, made their beds, taken out the trash, all the while knowing my place. I had never questioned it. I had never thought that one day I would be standing here with the power to change everything. And now, as Mrs. Lawrence's gaze shifted from me to the gates, the reality of the situation hit her like a wave. I could see her trying to form words, but they didn't come. I was no longer the invisible servant she could dismiss. I was standing there, a woman she had ignored for 2 decades, now holding the keys to the very house she had once thought of as her domain. I smiled faintly, but the satisfaction was fleeting. I wasn't here to gloat. I was here to reclaim something that was mine, something that had been denied to me for far too long. "I've been opening this door for you for 22 years, Mrs. Lawrence," I said, my voice calm but firm, every word deliberate. "Now I open it for myself." Mrs. Lawrence's face turned crimson. Her lips quivered, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "You can't do this," she shouted. "You have no right. This is my house. It's not yours. You've taken something that doesn't belong to you." I took a slow, steady breath. "It was never yours to begin with," I said softly. "It was always the bank's. You were just the tenants. I was the one who kept this house running for all these years, cleaning, cooking, doing the work you never appreciated. And now it's mine, all of it, because I worked for it while you squandered it." Her face paled further, and for a moment I thought she might collapse right there. Her grip on the doorframe tightened, as if she could physically hold the house together. Mr. Lawrence, standing next to her, finally spoke, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You can't do this, Maria," he said. "You can't just steal our house. This isn't right. We've always treated you well. We paid you." I didn't flinch. I had heard this argument before, the empty promises and the condescension. "You paid me," I repeated, my voice growing sharper, "but it was never enough. You never saw me as a person. I wasn't part of your world. I was just a maid, a servant. You were never grateful, not once." I saw Mrs. Lawrence swallow hard, the weight of my words hitting her in the most personal way. She had never thought much of me, and I had been too afraid to confront the truth of that until now. "I gave you everything," I said quietly, almost to myself, as I turned the key in the door and slowly pushed it open. "And now I'm taking it back." The moment the door creaked open, I stepped inside. I didn't look back at them. I didn't need to. They were powerless now. The house that had once belonged to them was now mine. They could scream, they could shout, but it didn't matter. This was my home, and I was taking ownership of every inch of it. Behind me, I could hear their voices rise in panic, but I continued walking through the grand entryway, breathing in the familiar scent of polished wood and leather, the scent of a life I had once been a part of but was never truly welcomed into. I looked out the large windows to the garden, where I had spent countless hours trimming hedges and planting flowers. Now it was all mine. The space, the silence, the power. They hadn't left yet. They would come back. I knew that. But for now, I allowed myself a moment of victory. I had outlasted them. I had taken control. The following days passed in a blur. I settled into my new life in the house, a life that felt strangely surreal, even after all the time I had spent here as an outsider. Every inch of this place, from the gleaming kitchen counters to the cold, pristine marble floors, now belonged to me. The house that had once been a cage, a place where I served at the whim of the Lawrence family, was now my sanctuary. But I wasn't naive enough to think they'd just let it go. I knew they would come back, determined to wrest control from me. They were desperate, and desperate people don't give up easily. I braced myself for their return, for the shouting, the demands, the pleas. The day they showed up, I was ready. They didn't knock on the door, of course. They never did. They weren't used to waiting or asking. So they barged right in. Mrs. Lawrence was the first to enter, followed closely by Mr. Lawrence. They looked different now, frantic, disheveled, broken in a way they had never been before. Mrs. Lawrence's makeup was smeared, her hair messily piled on top of her head, as if she hadn't had time to care about appearances. "Maria!" she shouted, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and fear. "You can't do this. This is a mistake. I don't care what papers you have. This house is ours." I remained silent, sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee in front of me. The room felt calm, almost serene, despite the storm brewing outside. "You don't get it, do you?" Mr. Lawrence said, his voice strained. "You can't just take our lives away like this. This is everything to us. Our reputation, our status, our home. You can't steal that. You're nothing, Maria. Just a housekeeper. You've never been one of us." I looked up slowly, meeting his gaze. For the first time, there was no fear, no servility in my eyes. They were just words now, empty, meaningless words from people who thought they could control everything and everyone around them. "You're right," I said calmly. "I'm not one of you, but that's exactly why I could take it all from you. You see, you thought I was invisible. You thought I was just a tool, a maid who cleaned up after your messes. But I watched, I listened. I saw how you treated everyone who wasn't in your little world, how you thought the rules didn't apply to you." I stood up slowly, setting my cup aside. I could feel the weight of the years pressing on my shoulders, the exhaustion, the resentment, the quiet anger that had built up over decades. "You were right about one thing," I continued, my voice steady but firm. "I'm not one of you. But now I own this house. I own everything you took for granted. I don't have to beg for respect anymore. I earned this, and now I'm keeping it." Mrs. Lawrence took a step forward, her face flushed with rage. "You think you've won? You think you're better than us?" Her voice cracked. "I don't care what you think you've accomplished, Maria. You'll never be one of us. You're still just the help, no matter what you own." I could see the desperation in her eyes. It was almost pitiful. She had never understood, never once grasped the fact that all the things she thought made her superior were nothing more than temporary illusions. Her wealth, her social status, her perfect house. It was all built on the back of people like me, and now I had taken it from her. "No, Mrs. Lawrence," I said quietly. "I'm not just the help anymore. I'm the owner now. I'm the one in control. And you're nothing but a memory." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with finality. Mrs. Lawrence opened her mouth to argue, but the words never came. Instead, her shoulders sagged as the realization hit her fully. They had no power here anymore. "You're not leaving," I added, more to herself than to me. She turned to her husband, who looked as if he might cry. But he didn't. He couldn't. They had never learned how to fight for anything that wasn't theirs by entitlement. They had never had to work for their victories. Now they were learning a painful lesson in humility. I watched them for a few moments, taking in their broken expressions, before I turned and walked towards the hallway. "Your things will be gone soon," I said without turning around. "A moving company will come to collect them. I'll have a sign put up on the mailbox. It's over." When I reached the front door, I opened it without a second glance. "Goodbye," I said, my voice calm. I closed the door gently behind me. The Lawrence family didn't return that night, nor did they come back the next day. I didn't see them again, not until the moving trucks arrived. They were gone, their belongings already packed up and taken away by strangers. The house was completely empty. The walls that had once echoed with their arguments, their laughter, their self-important conversations were silent. For the first time in 22 years, I was completely alone in this house, and it was mine. I cleaned the floors again, as I always had, but now it felt different. The act of cleaning, of scrubbing away the dust, no longer felt like a humble duty. It felt like a choice, my choice. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the mailbox and put up a small sign, "Ms. Maria Gutierrez, owner." When I returned inside, I stood in the middle of the living room, looking out at the sprawling backyard through the large windows. The house, which had once been a place of hard work and silence, was now my home. It was no longer just a house where I served. It was a place where I belonged. For the first time in my life, I went to sleep under a roof that no one could ever take away from me.